So for this video, I'm going to run through some of my all-time favorite Stephen King audiobooks. I've read a lot of Stephen King books through audiobooks, but when I first started reading King, I did it mostly physical. So there's a large chunk of his catalog that I've never even listened to the audiobooks, and I instead read them physically. So if there's any noticeable absences here, that's probably why. But I've listened to a lot of Stephen King audiobooks, enough to warrant a Stephen King audiobook video. And just because I choose the audiobooks for these books, it doesn't necessarily mean that these are my all-time favorite Stephen King books. They're just my favorite audiobook experiences when it comes to Stephen King. Anyway, enough of the preamble. Let's jump right into it. I'm going to go ahead and start out with one of King's nonfiction books, and that would be On Writing. And the audiobook performer is none other than Stephen King. It's a really good nonfiction book, but the audiobook really is good because it's basically Stephen King telling you how to become a better writer, and it's also half memoir. So it's him telling you about his life. And memoirs are always the best in audiobook form when they get the actual author to narrate it, and this is no exception. Stephen King has actually narrated a couple of his audiobooks. He's not the best, story narrator, I would say, but for this book and its purposes, it works brilliantly. And I've already mentioned this series in a previous video, my best fantasy audiobooks, and I'll link that down below. But just the whole Dark Tower series in general, both brilliantly narrated by Frank Mueller and George Goodall. They do such a great job with all the books, and yeah, just one of the best fantasy audiobook experiences that I've ever had. And these next audiobooks are great. They're all narrated by the same narrator, and that would be Will Patton. All of these books are narrated by him. Dr. Sleep, the whole Bill Hodges trilogy, The Outsider, and then he also narrates one, maybe two novellas in his novella collection, If It Bleeds. There's definitely a reason why Audible or, whoever's in charge of, narrating these books, getting them out, there's a good reason why they keep bringing him back, because he just narrates so well, he does the voice characterization so well, and he just does a great job. And all of these books are definitely good, and they're actually, enhanced most of the time by his narration. So I would definitely check these out. If you have read the books, but you haven't checked out the audiobooks, I would recommend it. This next book is definitely a King favorite, a standout for constant readers. It isn't necessarily one of my all-time favorite King books, but it is great nonetheless. And I think the audiobook, brilliantly narrated by one of my favorite actors, Michael C. Hall, he does a fantastic job. And the audiobook I'm, of course, talking about is Pet Sematary. I've read this book twice in my life. The very first time was a while ago, and I read it physically, and I did like it. I enjoyed it, but I was definitely underwhelmed because this book is obviously one of King's most well-known books, and I'd watched the movie a bunch, and, it was good. It just didn't live up to my very high expectations. But the second time I read it, I got the Michael C. Hall audiobook, and his narration, it made me love the story even more, which, you can't ask too much more of an audiobook, right? It went from being like a 3.5 star book to immediately being a 4, maybe even like a 4.5 star book, just by Michael C. Hall's narration alone. And I really wish he would narrate more books, because I think this is really the only main book he's ever narrated, and he would make such a terrific narrator. But yeah, if you've only read this book physically and you haven't given the audiobook a chance, I highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. Along the same lines as Pet Sematary, the first time I read it, I did enjoy it, but I was definitely underwhelmed, and I just wasn't a huge fan of it like a lot of King fans are. First time I read it, again, I probably gave it like 3 stars at best, but going back and listening to the audiobook narrated by Steven Weber, he did such... I definitely have an unpopular opinion when it comes to this book. I definitely don't think it's King's best. But I'm happy to say the second time around, I picked up the audiobook, brilliantly narrated by Steven Weber, and I could get through the story much quicker, much more easily with the audiobook, and I definitely enjoyed it more because of that. And I think I would end up giving this book either 3.5, maybe 4 stars. 4 stars might be too generous, which I know is harsh for a lot of King fans, but if I ever want to reread the book, for sure I'm going to go with the audiobook, because I don't know if I could read this book without it, really. The next audiobook I want to mention here is Misery. Now, I've read this book twice. The first time I read it was physically, the second time with the audiobook. Both times, I loved it. I loved it in equal amounts. I gave it 5 stars both times, and just easily one of the best novels he's ever written. I'm bringing up the audiobook, though, because whoever, and I wish I knew the name of the woman who does it. I'll put her name down here somewhere. But the woman who does the audiobook just does a fantastic job, especially when it comes to the narration of the main villain, Annie Wilkes. She does such a great job with inducing the creepiness factor into her character. Not only when she is, very quiet and just kind of domineering and talking very softly to Paul Sheldon, but also like in the book, when she's like yelling at Paul Sheldon, she's actually yelling in the audiobook, and when that happens, it's very jarring. You're like, oh my god. And obviously we all love the movie. Kathy Bates basically is Annie Wilkes, and that's one of the all-time best horror performances of all time. But the narration of this book is also very scary, especially when she's yelling at Paul Sheldon. Like, you really feel the terror. So yeah, not only is it one of my all-time favorite King books in general, the audiobook is definitely worth picking up, and I highly recommend it. This next book is also one of my favorite King books of all time. I've actually only read it once, and that was reading it physically along with the audiobook. And it's funny because it's actually one of the very first audiobooks I ever listened to. And that would be The Long Walk, narrated, of course, by Kirby Hayborn, one of my all-time favorite audiobook narrators. When I first got a subscription to Audible, I got a free audiobook credit to go along with it. And by that time, I was reading a lot of Stephen King books, so I naturally wanted to pick out a King book. And I decided to go with this book because I wanted to try out a Richard Bachman book. And I quickly fell in love with it. It's still one of my favorite King books that I've ever read, and I look back on it very fondly, and I really need to reread it because, like I've said, I've only read it and listened to it once, and that was a while ago, and I want to go back and give it another shot. This next book is by no means one of my favorite King books ever. It's good, but not terribly great. The main reason why it's on here is just because the audiobook experience is great, and it's definitely the main reason why I kept going with it, because the narrator, Maureen Ireland, did a fantastic job, and that would be Sleeping Beauties. I read this book physically while listening to the audiobook. I did them at the same time, and I will say that, like I said, it's not one of the best King books he's ever written, for sure, but the audiobook narration definitely helped propel me through the story. And I think without it, if I only read it physically, I don't think I'd be able to get through it. That would be a neat experiment, like way down the road. Just try to read this book without the audiobook and see how I feel. I have a feeling that I'm not going to like it as much because the audiobook was definitely great. And Maureen Ireland, like I've said, did a fantastic job. There's a lot of characters in this book, a lot of characters to try and keep track of, and she does such a great job differentiating between all of the character voices and making them sound unique. So even though it's not a great book, it's good, not great. If you're going to read it, get the audiobook. So yeah, those are all of my favorite Stephen King audiobooks and audiobook experiences. Do you agree with me on any of these? Do you not agree with me? What are some of your favorite Stephen King audiobooks and Stephen King audiobook experiences? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching and have a terrific day.